Good morning, everyone. If you'd like, go ahead and open your Bibles up to 2 Samuel chapter 1. We'll start off with that text this morning, 2 Samuel chapter 1. And I hope you had a good past week. The Lord has seen fit to bless us with another week, and it's good for us to start it off together in the way that we are today. And we are truly blessed, as Dwight mentioned in his prayer, to have opportunities to freely meet together as we are. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, David has been on the run for some time from King Saul, a number of years now, as a matter of fact. And a lot of traumatic events have taken place in his life, just recently, according to the account. But what happens in 2 Samuel chapter 1 is a man comes wandering into David's hideout with terrible news. And the news is that the nation of Israel's army has been soundly defeated by the Philistines in one of the biggest battles that they've had up to this point. And certainly Israel has encountered the most losses that it's occurred in a long, long time, maybe ever. And King Saul is dead. And his sons are dead, including Jonathan. Now, you may expect in one way that David would be somewhat relieved by this. After all, Saul has been kind of his arch enemy now. That's the reason why David is on the run. But really, this is terrible news for the nation. And David loves the nation of Israel. This is terrible news for God's people. And this is terrible news for David, even though the one who's been seeking his life is dead, also his best friend is dead. And that's Jonathan. And I want to talk about their relationship just a little bit, but I want you to notice in 2 Samuel chapter 1, notice what David says in verse 25. Oh, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan was slain on your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. This little reflection that David has here of his friendship with Jonathan. And he realizes, in so many ways, even though he and Jonathan have been separated for probably most of the time that they've known each other, in many ways, Jonathan has been more loyal to David than even his wife had been. And as David thinks about this, his mind may reflect on a number of things. Maybe his mind reflects back to the first time that he and Jonathan met, at least that we know of that they met. It seems that the first time they met is immediately after the battle that David had with Goliath. As a matter of fact, David has brought Goliath's head to present to King Saul. And Jonathan is there. And if you will, turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 18. 1 Samuel chapter 18. And I want you to notice, starting in verse 1. And so it was when he had finished speaking to Saul, this is David speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, you think about what's taking place here. First of all, this is the king's son, Jonathan. And Jonathan is giving David some of like the royal, the royal attire, the robe, and the sword and the bow. And by the way, we'll read, I don't know that we'll cover it in this, but during this time, weapons were so scarce. So these would be like some of the most precious possessions. And for a prince to give the royal robe and then also his some of the only weapons to exist in the army to David was something big. And Jonathan was probably not the same age as David. He was probably quite a bit older than David. And yet what Jonathan sees in David is something remarkable. And so he has this affection for him. He has this friendship with him. And so from this point on, they're going to be pretty close in so many ways. And he really takes David in, and he shows him unusual kindness in this. And it's not going to be too far removed from this before the first major threat to their friendship shows up. And it's a threat in the form of Saul's jealousy, Jonathan's father's jealousy towards David. See, David not only defeated Goliath, but he also won the hearts of a lot of the Israelites, and the Israelites began to sing his praise. And this triggered jealousy in King Saul. And Saul said, well, boy, I tell you what, they're ascribing all of this praise to David. What more could he have except the kingdom? And so now he felt threatened by David, so he seeks to kill David. If you will, look over at chapter 19. At chapter 19 in verse 1. So Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and all of his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, my father seeks to kill you. Therefore, please be on your guard until morning and stay in a secret place and hide. And I will go and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. Then I will observe what I observe, I will tell you. Thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he's not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good towards you. For he took his life in his hand and killed the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then would you sin against innocent blood and kill David without cause? So Saul heeded Jonathan's voice, and Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be killed. Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all of these things. So Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. So here, when it came between doing his father's will or defending David, he defended David. And you say, well, rightfully so. But this conflict's not going to be over, because it's not going to be long before Saul once again is seeking to kill David, although this time Saul is sharp enough to figure out, I don't need to tell Jonathan about this, because Jonathan will just try to defend him again. So he doesn't tell Jonathan about this. Turn over to chapter 20, 1 Samuel chapter 20. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, what happens is Saul tries to kill David again. David comes to Jonathan and says, your father's trying to kill me again. And Jonathan's like, no, Dad would have told me about this if that's the case. That can't be what's going on. And David says, let me tell you, there's not a step between me and death. He is trying to kill me. So Jonathan says, all right, well, let me go, and I'm going to find out what's really going on. And we'll work out a plan so that we can kind of find out what his motives are. You hide, I will go. I will kind of be around him, observe him, and see what's going on. And so they work out this plan to find out whether or not what Saul's intentions are towards David. Well, the intentions come back pretty clear. If you're in chapter 20, Saul is going to ask, well, where's David at? And Jonathan says, oh, well, he asked permission to go and be with his family. And Saul catches on to what's going on here. And so you notice in verse 30, I'm in 1 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 30. Then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. And Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, why should he be killed? What has he done? Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. And so here, Jonathan nearly gets killed in trying to defend David. Well, Jonathan goes to David, and he speaks to David, and pick up, if you will, in verse 34. Pick up in verse 34. No, I'll tell you what, drop down, if you will, to verse 42. 42 will be fine. Jonathan said to David, go in peace, since we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. And so he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. I'll tell you what, let me mention something else that took place here that we skipped. Go back, if you will, to verse 14. Verse 14. So when they're trying to figure out this plan, I want you to notice this agreement that Jonathan and David make with each other. Back to verse 12. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 12. Then Jonathan said to David, "The Lord God of Israel is witness. When I have sounded out my father sometime tomorrow or on the third day, indeed, if there is good towards David, then I will not, and I do not send him to tell you, may the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. But if it pleases my father to do evil, then I will report it to you and send you away that you may go in safely. And the Lord be with you as he's been with my father. And you shall not only show me kindness, the kindness of the Lord, while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my household forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "Let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies." And Jonathan again caused David to vow, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. Now, what Jonathan does at this point, Jonathan knows God's going to give the kingdom to you, not to me. I'm the prince, but the kingdom is going to you. Now, you promise me this, David, that when the time comes and you become king, you show kindness to me. And even after I'm gone, you show kindness to my family. See the type of relationship they have? Now, I'm going to go and find out what's up with my father. And the news is, yeah, Saul's trying to kill David. He's willing to kill Jonathan to get to David. So Jonathan comes and tells David, "You better go and hide." And so David does. As far as we know, that's the second to the last time that they ever see each other. There's only one other occasion that's recorded that they had an opportunity to meet and be together. If you will, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 23. 1 Samuel chapter 23. And this was maybe one of David's darkest hours. We don't have time to look at the context of all of this, but David has been fleeing from Saul. Saul has nearly caught him on a number of occasions. I'm talking like really close to catching him. David is running out of places to hide, and he's pretty. You look at some of the Psalms that David writes during this time, and they're pretty dark. He's in a pretty bad place. And so let's pick up reading in 1 Samuel chapter 23 and verse 15. Back up to verse 14. David stayed in the stronghold in the wilderness and remained in the mountains of the wilderness of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. So David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in the forest. Then Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the woods and strengthened his hand in God. For he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Even my father Saul knows that." And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and David stayed in the woods, and Jonathan went to his own house. And as far as we know, that's the last time that David and Jonathan ever had any communication. The next thing that David would hear about Jonathan is that Saul and Jonathan had been killed by the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. And that's the reason why David was so grieved at this. At least part of the reason why David was so grieved at this. In Jonathan, David had found a kindred spirit. He had found a source of strength. He had found a source of encouragement. And it's no wonder that he did. Because I want you to think about some things that these men had in common. Turn back, if you will, to 1 Samuel chapter 14. I want to look at two stories. One is going to be very familiar to you. The one in 1 Samuel chapter 14 is probably not as familiar to you, but I think it's one of the greatest stories in the Bible. And it's an incredible, we don't have as many details about it. We don't have like a chapter and a half or something describing it. But we have enough details to understand how amazing this story is. So in 1 Samuel chapter 14, I want you to look at, let me give you the context in chapter 13. So in chapter 13 and verse 5, it talks about the Philistines had gathered together to fight against Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and the people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and camped in Michmash. So you see the Philistines are building this huge army against the Israelites. Now, the situation with the Israelites is, in the latter part of chapter 13, is there's only two people that even possess a sword. That's Saul and Jonathan. Now, how would you like to be fighting an army that has 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and you've got two swords in your army? One belongs to the king and one belongs to the prince. That's the situation that the Israelites are in. They're incredibly outmanned and certainly outgunned on this. Now, chapter 14, in verse 6, there's a garrison of Philistines at one particular pass. And Jonathan, verse 6, said to the young man who bore his armor, "Come, and let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few." Now think about Jonathan's faith here. Him and his armor bearer. They have a weapon. They have several weapons between the two of them. Come with me. Let's go up to this garrison of Philistines. And who knows? The Lord can deliver. He doesn't have to have a big army. He can deliver by few. So let's go. And the armor bearer had some faith too, because the armor bearer says in verse 7, "Do all that is in your heart. Go then, and I am with you according to your heart." Then Jonathan said, "Very well, let us cross over to these men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say thus to us, 'Wait until we come to you,' then we will stand in our place and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up, for the Lord has delivered them into our hand. This will be a sign to us." So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, "Look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden." Then the men of the garrison called to Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we'll show you something." So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel." And then Jonathan climbed on his hands and his knees with his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan. And as he came after him, his armor bearer killed them. That first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within a half acre of land. And what this does is it shocks the Philistines. And the Philistines begin to flee, which allow Saul and whatever Israelites that he has with him to pursue, and they end up gaining a great victory on this day. Now, that story is probably not as well known as maybe some other Bible stories, but incredible faith on Jonathan's part. The Lord's able to save by few or by many. Let us go up. Let this be a sign to us. Oh, let's go up and attack. The Lord's delivered them into our hands, and the Lord did deliver him into his hands. Now, I want to compare that with a story that you probably know a little better. Turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now you need to remember that that story took place first. This story would take place later. The Philistines once again amass a great army. And they come and they meet with the Israelites down in the valley of Elah. And the battle is set. And you may think, well, the Israelites should have a little bit more courage this time. They've seen how the Lord can work for them. But the Philistines have a new trick. In verse 4 of chapter 17, a champion came out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. If we understand those measurements correctly, that would be about 9.5 feet tall. And he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of his coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, about 125 pounds. He was heavily armored, literally heavily armored. And he had a bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and its iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, about 15 pounds. And his shield bearer went before him. All right, so you look at this guy. He's a giant, literally. He's got all of this armor. Now think about the armor that the Israelites have. 2 swords, maybe a spear or 2 among them. And other than that, they're using farm implements to try to fight the Philistines. And here this champion comes out. And verse 8 says, he stood and he cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And you, the servants of Saul, choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the army of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Now notice the reaction from the Israelites. When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And no one volunteered to go fight Goliath. Saul didn't volunteer to go fight Goliath. Now, I don't know where Jonathan was. I don't know if Jonathan was somewhere else, although it would seem strange to me that Jonathan would be somewhere else, because this is the front line. And you would think you would want your prince, who has one of only two swords, to be there for this. But Jonathan is not mentioned in this. For 40 days, Goliath continues to come up and to challenge the Israelites with this same challenge. And no one responds. They tremble when they hear this. David comes into camp, not as a warrior, but as bringing some provisions to his brothers who were in Saul's army, and then also to some of the other soldiers that are there. And David hears this challenge. And David begins to go to some of the soldiers and say, do you not hear what this Philistine says? Is there not a reward for the man who will go and defeat him? Why is no one going to fight this guy? And it seems at first that David probably doesn't feel like it's his position to do so. He's not even in the army. But as time goes by, he realizes nobody's going to go fight this guy. And he says, well, I'll go fight him. And news comes to Saul. So he comes to Saul. And Saul begins to speak to him. And look at verse in chapter 31. Verse 31, chapter 17. And then the words which David spoke were heard, and they were reported to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Don't be afraid. Now imagine, here's this shepherd boy that's come into camp and heard this threat, and he said, now don't let anybody be afraid by this. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he's a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing that he's defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Well, what do you say to that? Well, what Saul said is, go, and the Lord be with you. No one else is willing to fight him. And David goes. And when David approaches the Philistine, you can imagine how Goliath felt. He lets us know how he feels in verse 43. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with a stick? So the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you've defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike and take from you your head. And this day I will give the carcass of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all of this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And so it says, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to David, that David hastened and ran towards the army to meet him, to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in the bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that it sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. All right, you know that story pretty well. Now, after the battle, when David brings the head of Goliath before Saul, we mentioned that's the first time that we know of that David and Jonathan met. And it's on that occasion where Jonathan's heart was knit to David. Why do you think these two guys, these two men, who would have been from very different backgrounds, one's a prince, one's a shepherd boy, would have been different ages. We assume that Saul's sons would have been quite a bit older than David. Why do you think Jonathan and David would become such close friends? Well, after reading these two accounts, it's not that surprising, is it? You see the similarities between them? The Lord's able to save. He doesn't need a sword or a spear. He doesn't need a great army. The Lord's able to deliver. Do you see the faith that both of these men had? So they became very close friends, and no wonder. Wouldn't it be great to have that type of friendship? Where you have so much in common, it's nearly impossible not to be friends. Where your souls are knit together by your common interests and your common goals. What was this relationship based upon? Those type of friendships, what are those type of friendships based upon? Well, common faith. What did both of them have in mind? God's able to deliver. And God's with His people. And He's not with those who defy His people. David and Jonathan had that kind of faith. They believed the same things. They had committed their lives to the same cause of serving Jehovah. And they had a common zeal. It wasn't just like, oh yeah, I believe that. No, zeal, if you know what the word zeal means, to be zealous about something, means to burn. To have fervent desire for. To feel heat about it. Be fired up about it is a good way of saying that. David and Jonathan were both fired up about serving the Lord. It's not just that they believed the same things, they were excited about the same things. You know, when you find someone that you're excited about the same things, friendship comes pretty easily. You like to talk about those things. You like to go and do those things. And being with a person that likes to talk about those things and likes to do those things feels good. It's an encouragement. And it draws you together. And you know, for Christians, there's a common parenthood. We're in the same family. We have the same Father. We have the same Lord. We've been made to partake of that one body. Let me ask you this. Who is your closest friend? Who's your best friend? You've probably thought about that. It's interesting because starting in what? Kindergarten? Everybody starts saying, who's your best friend? Who's your best friend? Everybody know. And maybe you don't have just one person. But who are those that you're closest to? What is it that you have in common with them? Is it a common faith? Is it a common zeal to obey God? Is it excitement, common excitement to do His will, a shared excitement to do His will? Is it your relationship with them in God's family? Or is it something else? Is it common history? Well, you know, we've been together. We were in the same class together since kindergarten. Or we grew up in the same neighborhood. Or is it similar hobbies? Well, we both like to hunt, or we both like to go and do this. Or is it we're same occupation? We work together, and therefore we spend a lot of time together. Those things are nice. Those things are enjoyable. But let me tell you this. The reason that I ask you that, and the reason I think that's a good question for self-examination, is many times who our best friends are tell us something about who we really are and about what's really important to us. Because we're drawn to people who value the same things that we value. And the more highly we value those things, the more strongly we're going to be drawn to people who value those same things. And if we look around us and we say, you know, I'm drawn to people who value worldly things, maybe that says something about us. And if we look around and say, I value people who value spiritual things, maybe that says something about us. Who's your best friend? Who's your best friend? What's really important to you? The point that I want to make in this lesson is I want to encourage you, we sing sometimes, make friends of God's children. I want to encourage you to make friends of God's children, with people who will strengthen your hand in the Lord as Jonathan strengthens David's hands in the Lord. People who will encourage and motivate you to be more faithful in serving Christ. People who will inspire you to do better spiritually and lift you up when you're discouraged. Make friends with people who will help you in that regard. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, Solomon says this, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion, but woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. You know, that's true when moving a refrigerator. But it's also true in spiritual things. It's also true in serving the Lord. He goes on to say, and again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him, and a 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. There's spiritual strength in being friends with those that are devoted Christians. When David was at his lowest, Jonathan was there to strengthen and encourage him. In Proverbs chapter 27, in verse 17, the proverb says, as iron sharpens iron. In other words, you have 2 similar objects. As iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. And you can think about the relationship with Jonathan and David. 2 men that are strong. And what did that strength do for each other? It sharpened the other one. It made the other one better. It made the other one stronger, more efficient, more devoted. So a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. You know, Paul asked Timothy to join him on some pretty dangerous trips. And you think, why did he ask Timothy? Because Timothy was probably a teenager. And Paul would have been on, I don't know how old he would have been, but he would have been a grown man for sure. 30s and 40s maybe. Why would he ask a teenager to go with him on these trips? Because what Paul saw in Timothy was something that he said, that's strength, that's spiritual strength. And they became really good friends. And Paul had complete confidence in him. When he wrote to the Philippians in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 20, he said, I have no one like-minded like Timothy. And he speaks of his proven character. And he talks about how he's serving the gospel, serving with him in the gospel. In other words, when Paul thought of Timothy, he thought of him as someone who could sharpen him. And how many people can you think of that could sharpen Paul? Why were they drawn to each other? Common faith, common zeal, common family. Our friends may tell us something about ourselves and what we really value. Last proverb, Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 24. It says this, a man who has friends must himself be friendly. If you ever wonder, I don't have any friends. Could it possibly be it's because you're not friendly? Let me rephrase that a little bit. Let me say that a man who has godly friends must himself also be godly. I told you the point of this lesson is to encourage you to make friends of God's children. Why are those people, why would godly people be drawn to be friends with you? Well, it would be because what they see in you is what they want to be. What they see in you is faith in God. What they see in you is zeal to do His will. That's why those people would be drawn to you. And so if you want to have godly friends, you need to be godly. By the way, let me apply this too. If you want a godly spouse, you need to be godly. If you want to attract a godly mate, you need to be godly. That needs to be seen in you. That's why Jonathan was drawn to David. That's why Paul was drawn to Timothy. They saw in them a strength and a godliness, and they said, that's a person that I could be close to. That's a person that would help me and that I could help as well. Let's work on being godly and surrounding ourselves with godly influences. So I talked about it's good for us to be able to start off the week by being together. And one of the reasons why I believe that God saw fit to have regularly assemblies of His people was so that we could regularly be around those who have faith in God, who have a zeal for doing His will, that we could share in this family together, that we could find that strength from each other. About to partake of the Lord's Supper. Sometimes we call it communion. Why do we call it communion? We're communing. We are sharing with. Who are we sharing with? Well, we're sharing with one another. And we're sharing with God. First day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. What was the significance of that? In Christ, we have this bond together. That's the setting that we're in this morning. So I want to end this lesson by saying this. In such a setting as this, if you need spiritual strength, now's a great time to find it. Reach out and let us know. Reach out and let us know. If you're not godly and you want to be godly, maybe you need to find out, well, I don't even know what that means. I don't even know how to go about that. Reach out and let us know. If you need to make correction in your life, reach out and let us know. Draw from the strength that you have around you right now. You won't have that strength everywhere, but you have it. You have it now. Use it so that we can leave here as iron sharpens iron, sharper than when we came. If there's some way that we can help you spiritually, we ask you to come, reach out, let us know right now while we stand. Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.